We're live now. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. There's the participant. So I guess we'll let folks in now and get this show on the road, eh? Everybody
Okay. Yep.
Feeling okay? All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. All right. I think most of the folks who are in the waiting room have been added now. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the Plug the Leak, Declining Oil and the Future of Alaska's Economy webinar. My name's Ryan Marsh. I will be just giving a couple introductory remarks here and then passing it over to get things started. So I'm Arctic Program Manager for the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, and our organization, along with Green Star, Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, Alaska Peace Center, have been working for several months to put together the Fairbanks Earth Week events. So this is one in a series of webinars and all week long. Some of you may have seen some of the poetry and art walk that got put up at Creamer's Field. That's going to stay up an extra week, I think, now. So through next week, if you haven't been out there yet, go on out and check that out. And just wanted to plug a couple more events coming up before we get started here. Tomorrow we have 2 webinars as well at noon. Phil White and Kathy Walling with Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition are going to be doing a webinar on GVEA and the power of member ownership and how you can use your power in that upcoming elections. And then from 4 to 6, Alaska Center will be hosting another webinar on climate policy in the Alaska legislature and having some question and answer there on that with Alyssa Quinton and Louis Flora. So those are coming up, and then on Saturday from 11 to 11:30, we're having a virtual march. I'll make a sign, get on to that, register for that Zoom event, and then check out all of the signs that other folks have made, and then we'll sing together and have a quick moment of camaraderie, celebrating our planet and moving towards action. So to sign up for any of those, go to Fairbanks Earth Week on Facebook or go to the website. The address is right here. Somebody can drop it in the chat, bit.ly/Fairbanks Earth Week, and you can register for any of those still coming up. And before I pass it on over to Sarah Furman, just want to say thank you to Mount McKinley Bank, GVEA, ABR, as well as Woodway for sponsoring all of the Earth Day events. Couldn't do it without you. So thanks again. Welcome everybody. And Sarah, you can take it away.
Thanks, Ryan, and welcome everyone. I'm super glad that you're here with us today. If you take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you're joining us from. If you know the traditional land on which you're sitting right now, it'd be great to hear that. Just want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territories of the Indigenous Alaskan peoples. I personally, my house, I'm on land that is the lower Tanana Dene peoples. So just want to take a moment and acknowledge that reality. And I also just want to say thanks to Ryan and Sarah and everybody else who has done all the behind the scenes and tech work to make these webinars happen. That's not something that is my forte, so I couldn't do it without them. My name is Sarah Furman. I live here in Fairbanks and just started at the beginning of this month as a campaigner for the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, working specifically with the Keep It in the Ground group, who I've been volunteering with for several months. And we organize with the goal of having a just transition to a regenerative economy. And specifically, we've been looking at the oil tax structure and how our state has basically been funding this extractive industry for decades and ways that we can change that. I think this concept is maybe particularly scary right now because the oil industry is in crisis and our state is dependent on that money currently, but we really see this as a moment and opportunity to change our economy, to move it in the direction of a more just and equitable economic system. So without further ado, I want to introduce Larry. So the way this is going to work is that Larry's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and he is a wealth of knowledge, as you will soon hear. And then Sikanik's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and we'll have time at the end for question and answer. If while they're talking you have a question, please just put it in the chat box. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. So Larry Persley has been writing about and working on oil and gas and state fiscal issues in Alaska for more than 40 years. He served as Deputy Commissioner at the Alaska Department of Revenue, worked on oil and gas issues in the Governor's Washington, D.C. office, and served as a legislative staffer for the House Finance Committee co-chair. Before his career in public policy work, he reported for several news organizations in Alaska, including Petroleum News, the Anchorage Times, Anchorage Daily News, Juneau Empire, and the Associated Press. He is now teaching journalism as a visiting chair at the University of Alaska Anchorage. So take it away, Larry.
Thank you. And I'm honored to see so many people online. I haven't talked to this many people in 2 months. So I'm going to keep it to 15 minutes. I'm really going to promise. And I guess I'd like to title my presentation, The Pits and the Pendulum. And that's because, look, we know the state's economy, the oil industry is definitely in the pits. But as you think about oil taxes, it's been this pendulum that's just swung back and forth between one extreme or another, and we've never quite figured out, I think, the right answer, a sustainable answer. So I want to try to quickly go through some history on oil taxes, because to understand the debate today, I think it's important to understand how we got into this mess. So back in the 70s and 80s, the state's production tax on oil had nothing to do with price. Price was not a factor. The rate stayed the same no matter how high or low the price went. That really wasn't very good. In fact, as fields aged, the tax rate, again, wasn't based on the price or the profit. It was just based on the per well production. So as older fields produced less per well, the tax rate went down. That really wasn't very good to the state. In fact, at one point, Kapark, which was the second largest field, or still is the second largest field on the North Slope, their tax rate was headed to zero under this formula. So after many, many years of fighting, in 1989, the legislature changed it. And really, it was the Exxon Valdez that gave the political, I guess, cover or the impetus, imperative to get enough votes in the legislature to change that. It brought Kapark back up to where it should be, raised the rate at Prudhoe. So that 1989 vote boosted state revenues from those two biggest fields, but it also set up a structure where the tax rate would be smaller on new oil. So we got ourselves, I think, into this mess where as old oil, which was paying a high tax rate, was declining in production, all the new oil was coming in at a very low or no tax rate. So you lose a barrel of old oil, you get a barrel of new oil, but your revenues go down, even if you're holding the same. So for about 15 years, I guess I would say the political muscle of the legislature held that structure. Even though many people realize this has to change, it's not sustainable, the legislature wasn't able to put together enough votes to change it. Governor Knowles also, when he was in there, opposed any change. And actually, it was Governor Frank Murkowski who changed it. And I know that's shocking to a lot of people, but back in 2005, Murkowski told the industry, hey, I need to talk to you about oil taxes. We got to have a talk. This isn't working. And the industry said, there's nothing to talk about, Governor. And that pissed him off. And say what you want about Frank Murkowski, he didn't like being told no. When you've been a U.S. Senator for 25 years, you're not used to someone saying no. So the Murkowski administration, with the governor's consent, the Department of Revenue changed how the satellite fields at Prudhoe Bay were taxed. And that one administrative change, which lumped these no-tax satellite fields into the high-tax Prudhoe Bay tax bracket, brought in a couple $100 million a year more to the state. And I think it's only important to look back that Murkowski sort of broke that ceiling a little bit. The industry wasn't happy. It wasn't what their governor was supposed to do. Then the next year, his last year, Murkowski was trying to get a gas line built. And under something called the Stranded Gas Development Act, Murkowski negotiated a deal with the producers. They would build the North Slope gas project. The state would promise not to raise taxes for 30 years. And in return, the industry would agree to doubling the production tax on oil. Well, we didn't get the gas line. The legislature rejected the 30-year lockdown on taxes. The one thing out of those three that the industry got was the doubling of production taxes, the one thing they didn't really want, but that's what came out. So then Palin comes in, takes Murkowski's tax structure where we had doubled the production tax, and she doubled that. So in a couple years, you had more than a quadrupling of the state take under production taxes from the oil industry. And Palin also put in a very steep progressivity factor. When prices went up, the tax rate went up very steeply, very fast, very high. And we got lucky because that's when oil prices went up to 120, 140 a barrel, I think, on some days. And to explain how this works, it's not like your personal income tax, where if you make nothing, your rate's 0, you make a little bit, your rate's 15%, you make some more, and the rate on the next dollar is 25%. Under Palin's tax structure, every time, and tax returns are monthly with oil production taxes, every time the value of the oil went up $1, the tax rate went up $1, but not for that next dollar. That higher rate applied to every dollar back to 1. So it got to the point where that steep curve, when oil was at the taxable $90 a barrel and plus, every time it went up another $1 that month, the state got 95% of that $1. Because that higher rate applied to all the dollars. Of course, look, the industry didn't like it. Prices were high. We made a lot of money with the state. Investment by the industry, they scaled it back because they said, hey, you're taking away all the upside at high prices. So they cut investment, but the state was rolling in money. Parnell came in 2013, pushed through a new tax bill that eliminated progressivity, just wiped it out. As kind of a political compromise, he said, well, hey, the Palin tax rate was 25% of net. And Parnell said, my bill is going to have a 35%. So we're eliminating progressivity, but it's a higher rate. Well, it was sort of a bit of phoniness, is the nice word, because they put in a per barrel deduction. So between $80 and $150 a barrel, the producers are allowed to deduct somewhere between $1 and $8 a barrel off the tax check that they send to the state. Now you wonder, well, between 80 and 150, well, back then oil was $108 a barrel. So they thought 80 to 150 seemed like a reasonable range for this extra deduction. And I guess to me, that's sort of a reminder, if you're gonna have a good tax structure, it's gotta be one that fits a wide range. Don't write a tax for what the situation is that year. So it's kind of functions, well, I guess a good analogy is, I doubt there's any corporation in this country that pays the full corporate tax rate under the IRS code. They find ways, deductions and such. So even though the rate may be 35%, because they're allowed to deduct at $1 to $8 a barrel, but it's really been $8 because it hasn't been up to 150, because they're allowed to deduct $8 a barrel from what they send the check. The effective rate, fiscal year 19, the one we finished last year when oil was $69 a barrel, the effective production tax rate was about 15% because of the deductions, the credits they're allowed to take. Just real quickly on the side, the law also says when prices are really low, forget the net, just pay 4% of your gross. And obviously we're in that situation now. In 2014, an initiative tried to overturn the Parnell, roll back to where it was. That failed. They only got, they got 47%. The industry got 53%. The Fair Share Initiative before you, or before Alaskans in this year's ballot, would eliminate that $8 per barrel factor that they're allowed to deduct from their taxes. It would double or triple the floor. Instead of 4%, at a minimum would be 10 to 15%. If oil were $60 a barrel and that initiative were to pass, the state would get $1.2 billion a year in additional production tax revenue, to kind of give you, I guess, to explain why the industry is fighting it so much. Certainly at $30 a barrel, which is double what oil is today, you're not getting $1 billion extra dollars out of this. If the initiative were to pass, maybe $150 million a year additional. At low prices, there's just not much there, no matter what the rate is. So in terms of credits, which get very controversial, there's two kinds of credits. The kind that Exxon, BP, and Conoco are allowed to use to deduct from the amount they send the state every month for their production taxes. Then, and just to let you know, between 2010 and 2019 fiscal years, that decade, the producers used that deductible credit against their tax liability to reduce the checks they sent in by about $6 billion over the 10 years. So it's a substantial amount of money, but like I say, that was kind of a political deal that legislators put through with Parnell to, we're going to raise the rate, but we're going to find a way out of it by putting in these credits, these deductions on their liability. So that saved the three big producers $6 billion. In many ways, I think they still paid us, they just paid us less. Okay, I think in many ways myself, the stupider credits were the ones where we actually cut checks to people. And these were the ones where companies like Armstrong and Kalis on the North Slope and Bluecrest and Fury and Cook Inlet and others, they weren't producing any oil, so they had nothing to deduct it from. It's not like they could take their credits and deduct it against their tax liability. They weren't producing, they were enticed, they were encouraged to come up here and explore and develop, and maybe there'd be some oil. So their credits weren't a function of how many barrels they produced, their credits were a function of how much they invested. Exploration, seismic, development drilling, you get a credit back. And the way it would work is, let's say a company would say, I got a $100 million plan to do some exploration in Alaska, but I don't have $100 million, but I'm going to get $60 million back from the state as a credit, because those credits were structured by the legislature basically as cash back in advance of any production. So I have a $100 million plan. I only got $10 million, but the state's going to give me 60 when it's done as a credit, a refund back on the work. I go to Bank of America and say, hey, I got a piece of paper from the state. They're going to give me 60 million at the end of the year. And Bank of America said, well, I'll give you 50 cash, sign that credit slip over to me. So I'd raise 50 million from the bank and I raise it. Anyway, that's how I would fund my exploration. When the credits came through, the state essentially would give Bank of America, they were making 10% or whatever on their investments. And in the 10 years between fiscal year 10 and 19, the state wrote checks, actual checks out of the general fund to pay off those exploration credits, about $3.5 billion. money out of the Treasury. And the idea was, if we incentivize, if we encourage, if we promote people to come up here and explore, they'll find oil, and over 20 or 30 years, we'll get production tax, royalty, property tax, income tax from the oil. We'll make back a profit on the 3.5 billion. That's not going to happen. I think that was wishful thinking. Last point on that, we still owe 800 million more on top of the money we've paid out, because we were paying it back as expected every year until 2016. At that point, the state started getting broker than it had been for the previous 30 years, and we stopped paying those credits back in full, and they've just accumulated. So the state owes $750, $800 million on those credits, where we've essentially stiffed the company and their bank, and it's in court, and I don't know how the hell it's going to settle. But anyway, you add that in, it's about $4.3 billion that we will have paid to those companies. Of course, when the state stopped reimbursing them under this credit program for their exploration, they stopped because they didn't have enough money on their own. So one of those unfortunate things. Some people thought it was a great idea, but it has not worked very well. So I guess in closing, the last point I'd like to make is, as we think about the state's economy, our over-reliance on oil dollars for decades, there's something called the Alaska disconnect. I don't know if people have heard of it, but what it means is you can talk about economic diversification all you want and new business up here, but unless that diversification, unless that new business produces a barrel of oil, the state doesn't get anything out of it. You entice or incentivize, to use those words, which I hate. Someone opens up an aluminum smelter or a new business in Alaska. There's no production tax, there's no royalty. They may have a lot of employees, which means the state's got to fund schools and roads and more troopers and all the services. But because the state doesn't make any money off that economic activity, without a sales tax, without an income tax, small corporations are exempt from corporate income tax. Any economic activity and new employees and services you got to provide are a loser for the state general fund. We're disconnected from reality with that. So unless it's a barrel of oil, we don't get anything, essentially. And I think that's something the state's got to correct as we go ahead. Otherwise, why would we want a new business in Alaska? Great for jobs, does nothing to pay for public services on the state level. And with that, hopefully I kept it to 15 minutes.
I think you did. Thanks, Larry, for trying to make sense of decades of confusing tax legislation, and just opening our eyes to the current situation and hopefully sparking some ideas about what we maybe need to do to move forward. We'll give Sikanik her chance to talk. Sikanik Maupin is Inupiaq, Italian, and Irish. She is a community organizer with Native Movement and co-founder of Sovereign Inupiaq for Living Arctic. She is a talented artist and mother of 2 lovely girls, and she has a wealth of knowledge. So we're excited to hear what you have to say, Sikanik.
Unmute myself. Oh. Hey, sorry, I was having some technical issues there with the mute button, but Pakalagipsi, everyone. Just welcome you in Inupiaq, and I'll start with my Inupiaq introduction. Uvanga Sikanik, Aningaringa Utkiag Vigmi, Akaga Harriet Maupin, Apaga Raymond Maupin, Akaluga Lena Kahakpak Simmons, Apaga Apaluga Abe Simmons Jr. Pausina. So my name is Sikanik. I was born in Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow. I was raised between Fairbanks and Anchorage. My mother is Harriet Maupin. My father is Raymond Maupin. And my grandmother is the late Lena Kahakpak Simmons. And my grandfather is a late Abe Simmons Jr. Pausina. So doing my introductions is just really important, and thinking a lot about what I'm going to be discussing today. I don't know as many technical things. That was really interesting. Thank you, Larry. I'm always really curious because seeing some of the Alaska Constitution and laws around this. It's so confusing and big and long. It's really nice to have it broken down. And what I'm going to be covering today is what's happening in the Arctic slope, who is primarily dependent on the oil economy, and what is happening now that the oil prices are actually in the negative, which has never been seen before. We are in an economy compared to the Great Depression. And on top of that, we have a virus that can hit our communities disproportionately. I am on the unceded territory of the Lower Tanana Dene people working out of what's known as Fairbanks. But my family is originally from Nuiqsut and Utqiagvik, and there's about 8 communities on the North Slope that and 1 hub city. And to start, I will go ahead and go to a presentation that I have. Sorry if I couldn't really screen share without, anyways, I'll start the presentation.
Are you not able to share your screen, Sikanik?
I am, sorry. I was trying to play the presentation, but then it kicks me out of the Zoom, so I was confusing myself. And I'm looking for my presentation right now. It's not showing up on my screen share, the one that I wanted to present. Maybe it's right here. Yeah, okay. All right, I'm hoping.
Great.
Great. I'm gonna go ahead and play the presentation now. Thanks for being so patient. I'm also not a super tech savvy person, so it's been an adjustment. All right, I wanted to start with a collection of pictures. This was me working in the North Slope. And each one of these visits wasn't just work for me. As you can see, I'm in the corner of the left-hand side at the top. Those are my daughters. We were on a work trip for a conference in Utqiagvik, and we're invited to go to Nuiqsut for a camping trip, which my work allowed as a way to gain knowledge in the work that I'm doing. So we went and hunted caribou, and these are my daughters hunting a caribou for the first time. In our language, it's called tutu, and they were eating the ends of the antlers. And at the bottom corner on the left-hand side is Gwich'in leader Bernadette Dementive, who has worked relentlessly with the Gwich'in Steering Committee to protect the Arctic Refuge. And the other side of me is Martha Itta, who is the Native Village of Nuiqsut tribal administrator. And this picture was taken in Oklahoma at a conference for frontline oil and gas communities. And the reason I think this is such an important picture is in this economy, in this oil boom and bust economy, there has been tactics to pin indigenous communities and people against each other. And that's been very prominent and publicly known for the Gwich'in and Inupiaq, especially with the Arctic Refuge. And just showing that unity and that we are here and that we are not just going along with the oil and gas industry that's happening and has been happening, that there have been people speaking out, not just community members, but people in leadership positions. And the other pictures was we presenting a toxic report, toxics and pollutants, and the effects on the community of Nuiqsut at the top. And I was dancing with my aunt because the community had invited us to Nari, a dance. And that was the first time I was able to dance with her. And when you go on trips, especially as an Indigenous person, you don't just go there, do your work and go home. You're visiting with your aunt, your cousins. You're talking about very hard subjects, about cancer, asthma, with your family members who are directly affected by this. And going into what's happening right now during this COVID-19 is very scary. Nuiqsut currently has 70% of its community members on medication to help them breathe. And as most of us know, COVID attacks the lungs. And the respiratory illness has risen across the North Slope. Nuiqsut is directly impacted by oil and gas because they're actually surrounded by oil and gas, but Utqiagvik has a natural oil, gas field there as well that does a lot of flaring, fracking in the tundra. And it's been a particularly scary time because of the lack of access to medication, clinical care, hospitals. And so going on to my next slide and just reading, this is our family, our communities, and I put our families, sorry about that. So In the last 3 months, the pandemic has changed our lives around the globe forever. The economy and oil prices comparable to the Great Depression. All points of entry to the North Slope are guarded, similar to the 1918 flu epidemic. Raven Air, largest rural Alaska airline, shuts down all operation and lays off all employees. Disaster declared by North Slope Borough Mayor, and all non-essential flights prohibited. Now, this, the biggest part of that, I think, out of all of these really shocking news that really we're all going through together, Raven Air pulling out and not being able to deliver food, medication, supplies, and flights for people that either need to get to a bigger city with access to a hospital, as many community members that have asthma would like to do, and just getting basic necessities has been very scary and unsure right now on the North Slope. And the disasters have been, there's been 7 disasters declared by the North Slope Borough, and the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation as well, which is the largest INCSA corporation. So of the Settlement Act for the Indigenous people in Alaska, that's the largest corporation. But not just that, they're the largest privately owned corporation as well. And they have laid off most of their employees. They have cut their dividends by 70%. And the ramifications, you know, there's a possibility of bankruptcy, people's livelihoods on the North Slope. Many people depend on those dividends to get by, to pay their rent, to pay their bills, and it has been reduced very fast. So people are scared right now. And what is also happening on the North Slope and around Alaska is the Bureau of Land Management is still going forward with, right now there's currently a project called the Master Willow Project, which has implications of significant reduction in caribou population, significant restrictions for subsistence users, for sea mammals and land mammals. And this is this presentation and the, sorry if you can hear my kids and my puppies in the back. The presentation that's being done right now is being done by the Bureau of Land Management, who's hosting hearings, which would normally be held in a public area. And this has been extremely problematic because there's such lack of access to internet in the rural villages. The connections for phones are not very good. And going from Nuiqsut and Nukavik, they have a little bit faster internet connection, but the rest of the North Slope does not have that because they're not right next to oil fields. And so what we're seeing on these calls is multiple drop calls. People are not able to access the internet, or it freezes a lot. I actually just attended the Nuiqsut hearing for the Bureau of Land Management, and the person facilitating the meeting was off of the meeting for about 5 to 10 minutes because they had issues, and they're located in Fairbanks, which is the 2nd largest city in Alaska. So it's a very flawed process that's being tested on Inupiaq people while there's a pandemic. And it is a project that will affect people in a negative way for food security. And this has kind of been the same rhetoric we've seen since oil has been discovered. And the reason I'm kind of putting all that out there is in the face of disasters and so much uncertainty and fear, the oil companies such as ConocoPhillips, which is the company that proposed the Willow Project, are still pushing forward for the oil and gas agenda. And during a time when the North Slope depends on the taxing the oil companies, of course, this is not going to be happening very well right now, right? With negative oil barrels, people are really uncertain what's the future is going to look like for the North Slope. And these companies have reassured us that they are here to look out for us. They want to be in partnership to both, you know, I guess, prosper off of these oil fields. Yet in the time where these communities need resources and, you know, support the most, the oil companies have been silent, and they have not been there to support, but instead take advantage of this time. And and we're also seeing that for many, many years, there's been advocacy to get onto a more sustainable economy. Just like the permanent fund, you know, dividend, that was never meant to be a ongoing type of income. It was supposed to be eventually invested in a more sustainable economy. Even when oil was discovered, we knew this was not going to be forever. This was a boom and bust economy, and we needed to invest into our futures while we still had the access, or we still had access to this big amount of money that was very fast. But instead, there's been a lack of that investment. And we're seeing that now with Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. Within a few months, they may be declaring bankruptcy. We're seeing with the North Slope Borough funding for essentials like the hospital, the clinic, the schools, and so many functions, housing, and all of these are not going to be met because we relied so heavily on the oil taxes. This is something, you know, before my generation and before my mother's generation, my grandparents' generation had spoken about this time. Specifically, Eben Hobson has so much, you know, resources out there of his speeches that talked about oil and gas will not last forever. We will be in an economy that's going to not be sustainable. And if we don't invest now and start to transition away from the oil economy, we're going to be in a very hard spot where people aren't going to know if they're able to pay basic bills and get basic needs met. And that's what we're seeing today. And there has not been a plan B. There has not been anything written down for a just transition into a more sustainable economy. And what we're seeing today is that on top of the fear of our health, people are also in fear of their livelihoods and paying bills. And that is what we're seeing throughout all of Alaska. And I think the really big lesson is transition is inevitable, but is it going to be just? And what we're also seeing up north is that the people hit the hardest are those that were already in a vulnerable spot. You know, people that relied on these dividends that came from oil, people that relied on jobs that were in the oil fields that are being laid off. And there's not a lot of support right now for those needs being met. So what we hope to do, and I'll go ahead and go to the next slide, is Sovereign Inupiaq for a Living Arctic is a group, a grassroots group and community organizing group that has wanted to focus not just on the North Slope, but Inupiaq communities from Nome to Koktovik. And these corporations have really separated us and divided that unity that we always had. We share languages, we share traditions, and we share a relationship to the land. And so Sovereign Inupiaq was created and put out into the world late last year. And since then, just getting more awareness and putting it in one spot, what's currently happening. And, but I think more importantly, because we've seen a lot of groups that want to, I guess, tell Inupiaq people or just Indigenous people in general how to fix their communities, how to get better. But with Sovereign Inupiaq for Living Arctic, and SILA for short, we hope to put that power back into the community's hands. The people closest to the problems are the people closest to the solutions. And we work from, you know, principles, and just reading a quick definition of an Inuit, plural Inuit, literally possessor or master, is a spirit or soul that exists in all people, animals, lakes, mountains, and plants. For Inuit people, human and animals are equal. All life has the same kind of soul or life essence, Inuit. Silam Inuit is the primary component of everything that exists. It is also the breath of life. Sila is believed to control everything that goes on in one's life. And this is, you know, something that is inherently put into a just transition perception. And when we look at the current state of things, the resource extraction, the very much change in values from my grandparents' generation, who had advocated against oil and gas, and who had said, we are doing this so that our people can get by and get basic needs, but we will transition and we will not cause so much destruction to our land that our animals and our water and our, you know, everything around us will be negatively affected. But unfortunately, my parents' generation had a very different mindset, and we can see this by our caribou has signs of starvation. We're having these meetings for this Master Willow Project that state clearly this will impact and decline the caribou population. Our whaling, which is a part of our life. And speaking of a just transition and being able to equitably support everyone, including our relatives with 4 legs, including our relatives in the water, that's really going to be, it can't be oil anymore. It can't be an extractive industry. It has to be something that's sustainable for all. And that is the Inupiaq values. I believe I have, oh, that was the last slide. And I'll go ahead and get myself back here. I don't know how to. But you guys can just watch that for a second. Am I about 15 minutes in or?
Yeah, you're right about that.
Okay, I'll go ahead and.
I think you're no longer sharing.
Oh, great.
Screen sickening.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and just close up then and say that I'm really excited about going into the future. Although it seems really scary right now and uncertain, what was told for me and for people before me that had been saying, kind of predicting the state that we're in today, when we had said we need to transition away, we need to get to a more sustainable economy, we were told it's impossible. There is no way you can shut down the oil fields today. Everything would collapse. We wouldn't know what to do. But we're seeing right now the most important things in life is food, water, health, and shelter. These are the essentials that we need in life. And it has become, not just locally, but globally, we're seeing that that is the priorities that we all have to save and work towards. And it's happening much faster than I could have ever really imagined. And so I hope this time going forward, we'll see this as a time of change, a change in consciousness globally. And hopefully going forward, we will live by those indigenous values, those indigenous ways, and go forward treating everything with respect and learning how to live with it in a good way. So thank you all again, and thanks for having me here.
Well, thank you, Sikanik, for putting the human face on the crisis and what's going on right now. Really appreciate that. Just been following, probably a lot of you have seen in the chat, but I think it's worth just having, there's a couple of questions posed to Larry. This first one, Larry, if you just want to speak to it, I'm scrolling up. From Ryan, says, we no longer have the exploration credits, which are those ones you were just talking about, that the state is paying out the money to these companies that weren't even paying us taxes because they weren't producing. But can't companies, including the big ones, write off transportation and capital expenses from their production tax? So for example, Conoco can explore in NPRA and drill holes there and write that off from production in Prudhoe.
No, they can write it off their corporate income tax, but the deductions on a production tax are limited to expenses on that lease. So what you spend somewhere else, you cannot deduct from your production taxes at Prudhoe. They can accumulate those losses at NPRA, and if they ever have production tax, well, they can deduct it only from production within NPRA. Production tax is by field, corporate income tax is for the entire company.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And then there was one more question about the mining tax for folks. Does mining production provide revenue to the state? And if not, would new residents of communities working at mines result in the paradox you mentioned of the state needing to fund services?
Right, and the state does have a mining license tax, it's called. It raised under $50 million last year, a little bit more than the state made off motor fuel taxes or alcohol taxes. So if, I guess you have to figure out how much the state paid to provide services in mining communities and mining families. But again, without an income tax or a sales tax, the state doesn't make as much as other states make off economic activity.
Okay. And I just want to invite people, again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in our chat section. In the meantime, I've got a list of questions that I'd be happy to start asking. So I'll go to Sicanic since Larry just answered one. And Larry, you can comment on this too as well. So
Sure.
what do we want to consider? What do we need to consider in a just transition? And you talked some about already who's going to be impacted by the decline of oil, but what are some of those considerations for particularly the rural communities, but all of Alaska?
Hey, thanks for asking. I think we need to consider that in a just transition, we talk about the word just and what does that mean? And right now, some examples are, the lack of hospitals. And so people are, again, leaving their communities and needing to be in the city alone. Children that have been having asthma attacks already are also, families are trying to find a way out of the village. And so it's just a really scary time right now. And this was a system that made this type of disproportional effects happen when we see this systematic racism, this environmental racism, when we have extractive industry that are targeting indigenous communities that have lack of resources and lack of some of the, colleges and these classes about law and what their rights are, and being held in this economic hostage situation. Now we're seeing that, the housing crisis, and what the housing crisis is, the permafrost melting and houses are collapsing into the ground. They're going into the ocean. That this could have been predicted. And going forward, how do we stop when a natural disaster does happen, which it will? And we've seen it time and time again, that when communities of color, communities that have been historically in poverty are hit the hardest, going forward, how do we protect those people? How do we have more equitable access to hospitals, respirators, and these types of equipment? And also, how do we protect people that don't necessarily subscribe to this Western economy, that haven't been involved in a lot of these processes, that just don't really know where to go to now? And that's what I would say is keeping at the forefront of your mind is, how can we extend those resources to people that have less access to those?
Thanks, Sicanic. We have some questions coming in. Let's see, one of the earlier ones. Jessica asked, and I think this is going to be a really important conversation moving forward, trying to figure out how to fund the state with oil declining and likely never returning to the profit levels that we have seen in the past. So how do we engage in a conversation about income tax in a recession or a depression? Larry, do you want to try to take that on? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, you painfully enter into it. I think we have to realize we will never, I don't think, and it's certainly my opinion, ever have anything that generated revenue for the state general fund like oil. We could have an income tax, a sales tax, but it would be half, a third, a quarter of what oil generated. So I think Alaskans are going to have to look at which tax they want on a state level, income or sales, how high they want it, and what we're going to have to get rid of because we can no longer afford it. Is that the dividend? Is that services? That's going to be a fundamental remaking of the Alaska economy. What level of public services versus the dividend is going to be, I think, the first battle. If you pay a dividend, it just doesn't add up. You're going to have to cut the hell out of services.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. I think the reality is it's going to have to be a dynamic response to the current situation. There's
right.
no one solution.
Correct.
But hopefully, if we're willing to open our minds to a variety of changes, we can try to solve this without it going too poorly. So let's see. There was a question for Sicanic in here, and it was, why does, you mentioned that 70% of the community members have to be on meds for breathing, and why is that?
So the community is, I'll start with the health aide. Rosemary Atungayuruk has been a really big advocate for health because she saw an increase 50% in respiratory illness when the oil fields were established closer to Nuiqsut. And in 2012, Repsol, the oil company, had a blowout of chemicals that if you visit Sila Inuit, you can actually see a 30-second clip of the worker who caught it on camera. And you see this black smog just blowing into Nuiqsut. And there were reports after that of children who had to be rushed or medevaced out of the village for having asthma attacks. People have had breathing issues since that, although it hasn't been officially acknowledged that that has directly impacted breathing. There's many articles and journals written about that exact time that that happened. And just in general, the toxics and pollutants that are being inhaled every day by community members, especially when the wind blows from the oil fields into Nuiqsut, people have a harder time breathing. And so now what we see is 70% of the communities are on medication to help them breathe. And some of the disputes are, there's tobacco, there's exhaust running in the winters, but this is, unreal to see a 50% rise and then to not acknowledge the information that's been established of the side effects of the pollutants and toxics that these companies are stating that are being put out there. Benzenes, turulose, I wish I had it in front of me, these very serious chemicals that they attack the lungs. So I don't think it takes a lot to connect the two. I hope that answers the question. And I also wanted to say for the last question, just to pose a question for people to think about is what are you willing to give up? Because unfortunately, going forward, there is no way to get an economy that will support many of the ways that we have been living. And that is buying $70,000 vehicles, $100,000 boats, $500,000 homes that are too big for us, that are unnecessary, having multiple vehicles when you don't really need it. These are the type of luxuries that we're going to have to ask, are we willing to give up to have a more just transition into an economy that is sustainable? We can't go back, and that's including our lifestyles. And I think that COVID-19 has really shown us again what is priorities and that we can give those things up. But what's most important is the access to clean air, food, water, and shelter in our families.
Yeah, thanks, Sikanik. And I think it's true. There's going to be solutions that are both, people are going to have to make personal changes and accept changes in how they live their lives, as well as statewide and nationwide changes in dealing with both the current oil crisis and just the climate crisis as a whole. I wanted to go back over to the questions, and I think Pamela just asked, Larry, if you know how much profit in oil worth did the oil companies haul out of Alaska since PB began and last year?
I don't know. Nobody knows. BP and Exxon are not, companies are not required to break out their profit statements, how much they made in Texas, how much they made in Alaska, how much they made in Azerbaijan or the North Sea. And Hillcorp, particularly, since they're a private company, doesn't have to report anything. Conoco historically is the only one who has said, this is how much we made in Alaska, this is how much we made in North America, this is how much we made in Australia. Conoco's Alaska operations have always had a higher profit margin than anything else, and that's not our tax structure. That's a function that Conoco does not produce gas here. All they produce is oil. Oil, other than this past week at $15 a barrel, oil historically has been substantially more profitable than natural gas. Every place else Conoco produces, they produce gas with oil, and that brings down their profit percentage in Texas or Australia or any place else. So Alaska, higher rate of return for Conoco, but that's a function of it's only oil here, and they re-inject the gas. They don't have to sell it at pennies.
Thanks, Larry. So I'm sorry, everybody, there's a lot of questions coming in, and I know we can't get to all of them. There's lots of good ones. actually really like this one that Ryan just posted. Can we rely on the legislature to do what is necessary to move us into a new economy that works for all of us coming out of the crisis? What is the role and responsibility of all of us as Alaska residents in helping to make the changes we need? And I think, you know, historically, Larry, you spoke to the tax structure just like going back and forth, and it doesn't seem like it was necessarily made for the good of Alaskans over time. So it's, you know, it's an interesting question to say, like, can we even trust our legislature at this point? And if not, what can we do? And I think Nick or Larry could speak to that.
The short answer is elect better legislators. The legislature has the power to adopt an income tax, to structure the permanent fund, to decide what services are going to provide. Right now, as we know, the governor has a solid block of legislators with him that prevent any veto overrides, that believe in an unaffordable full dividend that would go to their grave before they vote for an income tax. So it's going to come down to November and electing a majority of good legislators.
Did you want to add anything, Nick?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the chat right now and trying to multitask, but I think that we can see that many of the people that we've had in governance, I'm be truthful, I'm not super familiar with the government structure in terms of trying to get an answer right off the top of my head, but a lot of the same people have been in office that are not progressive, that are not acknowledging the serious effects we're seeing outside. And I think that people power, community organizing, we see makes a huge difference. And when we have a team, for example, like Larry, who has so much knowledge of this technical information, and then you have people that are grassroots and they are in the communities and you're getting them together, that going up to the legislator or going up to these places that hold these decision-making powers is where you're going to see a lot of those changes happen. So you go out and vote. You also get people share knowledge about the candidates, and whoever you know that could represent us, get them to sign on and run. Thanks.
Yeah, she's right, because I've noticed a shortage of good candidates in a lot of districts. People run unopposed, there's no one good, and it's got to get people willing to endure the hell of social media that's going to come down on them if they run for office. But it's the only way you're going to change some of those seats.
Yeah, thanks for that, you guys. And I think there's a lot of ways that people can engage in their communities beyond just voting, and voting is important, or putting yourself out there and running for a position or an office. That's a great way to go. But there's also, I mean, there's nonviolent direct action, and there's art, and there's just all kinds of ways that people can get involved. And I'm gonna kind of close on that note and say, like, we need everybody. We want policy analysts, and we want artists and graphic designers, and we just need everybody in this movement to rise up and choose the right path for Alaska's future. And we want to, and I'm going to just ask Ryan to make the chat private, because if you want to stay involved and you want more information, we just want to invite you to put your email address in the chat, and we can get in contact with you after. And King, the Keep It in the Ground working group is just one working group that's part of the FCAC, Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition. So there's regenerative economy, there's renewable energy, there's interfaith, there's policy and politics, there's all kinds of different groups, and we would love to get you connected with the one that matches up with what you want to work on. And on that note, we also have the general meeting, the FCAC general meeting is on May 2nd from 10 to 1. And that's a great opportunity to show up on Zoom. And you can learn about all of our working groups and see what we've been doing, and get connected there. And there is also some good resources posted in the chat by Jessica and Lynette, I think both posted on Just Transition. So if you want to learn more about what a Just Transition framework actually looks like, what we're going for as we move out of an extractive economy, those are some great resources. So let me see, I just want to make sure I'm not forgetting to mention anything. I don't think so. So thank you all for attending. Again, put your email address in the chat if you want more information. We can connect you up with different groups, or if you want to be involved in our campaign to try to keep the oil in the ground and change how our state functions. We would love to have you, and have a great night. Enjoy the sunny weather.
Hey all, before we close here, I just want to mention one more thing. I know that Jessica, I think, put in the website for justtransitionak.org. Just want to shout out to a bunch of webinars that they're putting on. There's a whole group, coalition of organizations across the state putting on webinars to discuss a just transition for Alaska, and well worth getting plugged into those and tuning in. They had one, I think, yesterday that was pretty incredible. So that's another avenue to get plugged in. But if you want to stay in touch with what FCAC is doing, put your email down in the chat, and only the hosts here can see it. We'll collate those and get you plugged in where your energy's most needed, where you want to put it. So thanks all, and thank you, Larry. Thank you, Sikanik. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.